In the summer of 1863, East Texas felt forgotten by the rest of the nation. The Civil War raged hundreds of miles away in places like Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but along the slow bends of the Neches River, the violence was quieter. It hid in whispers, in missing men, in unmarked ground that no one dared speak about after sundown. The town of Briars Hollow sat low against the water, a struggling settlement of sawmill workers, cotton traders, and Confederate deserters trying to disappear into the cypress swamps. Spanish moss hung from the trees like funeral veils. The river moved thick and brown, carrying driftwood, animal carcasses, and sometimes things no one wanted to claim. That July, the heat pressed down like a punishment from God. Livestock died standing, crops shriveled, the river shrank, exposing muddy banks that hadn't seen sunlight in years. That's when the bones surfaced. It was a boy named Caleb Turner who found them first. I am 12 years old, barefoot, fishing alone before dawn. His hook snagged on something pale beneath the shallow water. At first he thought it was a log. Then the skull rolled toward him. The jaw hung loose, one eye socket packed with river silt. A rusted iron shackle clung to what remained of a wrist bone. Caleb ran all the way back to town without looking behind him. By noon, half of Briars Hollow stood along the riverbank. The sheriff, Edwin Mercer, pushed through the crowd, his boots sinking into the muck. He was a large man with a war wound he refused to explain and eyes that rarely blinked. He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing people would later remember. The bones weren't alone. As men with shovels prodded the mud, more shapes revealed themselves beneath the waterline. Rib cages tangled in roots, femurs jutting out like broken fence posts, scraps of rotted cloth pinned under stones. Someone had weighed them down. Someone had meant for them to stay hidden. An uneasy silence fell over the crowd. These weren't soldiers. No uniforms, no proper burial. Several of the skeletons still bore shackles. A woman near the front began to cry, quiet at first, then harder. Sheriff Mercer ordered everyone back. He claimed it was flood displacement, old river drift, nothing more. He told them war brought strange things downstream. But the Neches hadn't flooded, and the current was barely moving. That evening, as the sun bled red across the water, something else surfaced. Not bones. A hand. Fresh, swollen, still warm, and it was reaching toward the shore. What Sheriff Mercer did next would divide Briars Hollow forever, and by morning the river would make it clear it wasn't finished giving back what it had been forced to swallow. By sunrise, the story had already split into two versions. In one telling, the hand belonged to a drowned drifter carried downriver from some distant skirmish. In the other, far quieter version, the river had started correcting something that never should have happened. Sheriff Edwin Mercer chose the first version. He ordered 2 men from the mill to drag the body ashore under the pretense of public safety. The corpse was bloated from water, but unmistakably recent. The skin had not yet split. The fingernails were intact. There were bruises around the wrists, dark, unmistakable bands where iron had pressed too tight. And there were no bullet wounds. Mercer crouched beside the body, his jaw locked. A few townsfolk noticed his hands tremble before he folded them behind his back. "This one's a trespasser, probably stealing livestock upriver, fled into the swamp and drowned." The explanation sounded rehearsed. Caleb Turner stood behind his father, staring at the dead man's face. Something felt wrong.
The body didn't look like someone who had drifted miles through current. There was barely any river debris caught in his clothes, no bite marks from gar, no tearing from submerged branches. It looked placed. By midday, 3 more bodies rose to the surface, all men, all shackled. The townspeople began counting silently. Briar's Hollow wasn't large, most faces were known, but these weren't strangers from far-off battlefields. Several older residents recognized features, men who had passed through town months ago under guard. Prisoners, laborers, captives brought in under Confederate authority to repair the rail line after sabotage. Men who were said to be transferred south. Transferred. The word began to taste bitter. Mercer ordered the bodies buried immediately in a patch of dry land beyond the cotton fields. No ceremony, no markers, just shallow graves and dirt kicked in fast.
When Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward and demanded the men be identified, Mercer cut her off with a warning glance. "War demands hard choices," he said flatly. That afternoon, the heat shifted. Dark clouds gathered without thunder. The air grew metallic. Even the insects went quiet. Then the river began to rise, not from rainfall, not from flood. The water swelled against the banks as if something beneath it was pushing upward. By dusk, dozens of pale shapes pressed just below the surface, visible through the murk, too many to count. Children were rushed indoors, doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and from inside the jailhouse, someone started screaming. The sound wasn't distant, it wasn't coming from the river, it was coming from one of the cells. Sheriff Mercer hadn't put anyone in there that morning, yet when he reached for the keys, the screaming stopped, and a second voice began whispering his name from inside the dark. Sheriff Edwin Mercer stood alone in the narrow corridor of the Briar's Hollow jailhouse, keys clenched tight enough to cut into his palm. The whisper had stopped, but the silence inside that building felt heavier than the July heat outside. The jail consisted of 2 cells, both iron-barred, both visible from the front desk. That morning, Mercer himself had checked them. They were empty. He had made a show of it, rattling the locks in front of Deputy Collins, as if to reassure more than inspect. Now one of them smelled like river rot. Mercer forced himself forward. Each step echoed against the plank floorboards. A faint dampness had crept along the wood, though no rain had fallen. He could hear something inside the cell, slow, uneven breathing. He unlocked the outer gate. Deputy Collins hovered near the doorway, unwilling to step closer. "Sheriff, there ain't supposed to be nobody in there." "I know that," Mercer snapped. He reached for the bars and peered through. At first he saw nothing but shadow, then movement. A man sat slumped against the far wall, wrists bound in iron shackles bolted to the floor. His shirt clung wet to his chest. Mud streaked his face like war paint. His eyes were open, too wide, unblinking. River water pooled beneath him. Mercer staggered back. "That's not possible," Collins muttered. The shackled man tilted his head slowly, his lips cracked open. "You said no one would ever know." The voice was hoarse, layered, as though spoken through water. Mercer's breath shortened. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure began to rise, joints stiff but deliberate. Water dripped from his cuffs, yet there were no footprints leading into the cell, no broken locks, no forced door. "You weighted us down," the man continued. "You said the river would carry it away." Collins crossed himself and fled the building. Mercer fumbled with the keys, unlocking the cell door. It swung inward with a long, metallic groan. He stepped inside, revolver drawn. The shackled figure lunged. The lantern near the desk shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. A single gunshot exploded through the jailhouse. Outside, townspeople froze mid-step. When they rushed in minutes later, they found Mercer alone inside the cell. The revolver lay at his feet. The shackles were still bolted to the floor, empty, but Mercer's boots were soaked to the knees, and carved into the wooden wall behind him, deep and deliberate, were 3 words: "We are rising." By nightfall, the river had climbed higher, swallowing the first row of cypress roots along the bank. And just as the town began to pray for daylight, the church bell started ringing on its own. No rope moved, no hand touched it, and it would not stop. The church bell rang through the night like a warning no one could silence. Briar's Hollow had only one church, a narrow white structure built from pine and stubborn faith. The bell rope hung plainly in the open entryway. Anyone could see it swinging when called by human hands.
But now it hangs still, and yet the bell continued to toll, slow at first, then faster, then frantic. Families gathered in their homes, whispering prayers over oil lamps. Horses bucked in their stalls. Dogs howled and then fell into uneasy quiet. The air felt charged, thick enough to taste. Sheriff Mercer stepped out onto the dirt road, revolver strapped at his hip, boots still damp from the jailhouse floor. He moved toward the church with rigid determination, refusing to look at the river behind him. A small crowd had already formed. No one dared step inside. Mercer pushed through the doors. The sanctuary smelled of wet wood. Moonlight spilled through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the pews. The bell rope hung perfectly straight, unmoving. Yet above them, the bell clanged with mechanical precision, vibrating dust from the rafters. "Enough," Mercer muttered. He climbed the narrow staircase to the loft. Each step creaked under his weight. The ringing grew louder the higher he ascended, until it felt less like sound and more like pressure against his skull. When he reached the bell tower, the noise stopped. Instantly. Silence crashed down harder than the ringing had. Mercer stared at the bell. It swayed gently, as if just struck. No mechanism, no rope movement, no visible cause. Then he saw it. Something dark streaked along the inside of the bell's rim. He stepped closer. It wasn't rust. It was writing, scratched deep into the metal. Count them. A sudden scream tore through the stillness below. Mercer rushed down the steps, nearly slipping. He burst out of the church doors and followed the crowd's gaze toward the river. Lantern light flickered along the bank. Bodies lined the shore now, laid side by side in unnatural order, not tangled, not drifting, arranged. Men, all of them, shackles intact, 31. Mrs. Whitmore covered her mouth in horror. "That's how many passed through here last winter." No one corrected her. Mercer's face was drained of color. He had signed the transfer documents himself. 31 men accused of aiding Union sympathizers. 31 men were removed under orders from Confederate command. Orders that never reached headquarters. The river had not miscounted. A low rumble echoed beneath their feet. Not thunder. The ground shifted. Behind the line of bodies, the river bulged upward like something enormous pressing from below. And then, in the center of the current, a mass began to rise. Not one figure, not 10, but dozens, and they were standing.
The figures stood in the river as if the current obeyed them. Water swirled around their waists, yet none of them staggered. Lantern light flickered across pale faces and hollow eyes. Their clothes clung heavy and torn. Iron cuffs still fastened around wrists that should have long since rotted away. No one moved on the riverbank. 31 bodies lay arranged at the shore, and in the water beyond them, more shapes kept rising. It was Caleb Turner who whispered what everyone else was afraid to say. "They're waiting." Sheriff Mercer stepped forward, though his boots sank into mud that now felt less like soil and more like something breathing. His jaw tightened. He had worn command like armor his entire life. He would not surrender it now. "This is hysteria," he declared, voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Some kind of swamp gas, tricks of light." The explanation collapsed the moment one of the river figures lifted its head fully from the water. Its eyes were open, clear, aware. The man's face bore a scar across the cheekbone, one Mrs. Whitmore recognized instantly. "That's Thomas Reed. He fixed my roof last fall." Thomas Reed had been arrested for allegedly passing letters between farms rumored to shelter Union deserters. He had vanished after being transferred.
Now he stood waist-deep in the Netches, staring directly at Sheriff Mercer. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, Thomas raised his shackled hands and pointed toward the town. The others followed. 31 on the shore, dozens more in the water, all pointing. A tremor rolled beneath Briar's Hollow again. The riverbank cracked along a jagged line, swallowing 2 lanterns whole. The water advanced another foot without rainfall or wind. Deputy Collins stumbled backward. "They're accusing us," he said, voice shaking. "They're naming us." Mercer's gaze never left the river. Last winter was desperate. Supplies were thin. Loyalty was thinner. Confederate command had demanded swift justice for suspect traitors. Mercer had assembled a militia of town men, farmers, mill hands, storekeepers. They had gathered the accused under cover of darkness. They had bound them in iron. And when transport wagons never arrived, a decision had been made along this very riverbank. Quick, quiet, permanent. The river was deep then. Mercer felt something grip his boot. He looked down. A hand had broken through the mud, fingers digging into leather. Another hand emerged beside it, then another. The ground beneath the townspeople's feet began to split open in narrow fractures, thin streams of water bubbling upward like veins reopening. The figures in the river took a single step forward. The current did not resist them.
And from somewhere beneath the surface, a voice carried across the water. Calm, collective, and unmistakably clear. "Confess." The church bell began ringing again. This time it wasn't the tower calling. It was coming from beneath the river. The sound beneath the river did not echo. It vibrated. A deep metallic tolling rolled through the mud and bone of Briar's Hollow, as if the earth itself had swallowed the church bell and was ringing it from below. The figures in the water did not advance again. They simply stood there, arms lowered now, watching, waiting. Sheriff Mercer felt the pressure of their silence more than their presence. He drew his revolver and fired into the river. The shot cracked the night open. The bullet struck the surface and vanished without a splash. The figures did not flinch. Behind Mercer, something snapped. Old Jeremiah Pike, mill foreman, father of 4, fell to his knees in the mud. "We didn't mean for it to go that far," he cried, voice breaking in a way no one had ever heard. "It was supposed to scare 'em, just scare 'em." The river answered with another low toll. Jeremiah clawed at his own collar as if choking on unseen hands. "They were bound already. They couldn't fight back. We just pushed." His confession hung in the humid air.
The water along the bank receded an inch. A murmur spread through the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore stared at Jeremiah, horror reshaping her grief. "You told us they were moved south. You swore it." Jeremiah sobbed harder. "Sheriff said it was lawful, said it was war." All eyes turned to Mercer. He stood rigid, jaw locked, refusing to speak. Sweat ran down his temples despite the cooling air. The ground shifted again. Another man stepped forward, Samuel Crowley, store owner. His hands trembled visibly. "We tied stones to their chains," he admitted, voice barely steady. "The river was high. We thought it would carry them off before anyone came looking." The figures in the river tilted their heads in eerie unison. The tolling softened. A third man collapsed beside Jeremiah, then a fourth. One by one, members of the winter militia sank to their knees along the riverbank, forming a crooked line in the mud. Words spilled out in fragments: fear, orders, obedience, survival.
Each confession pulled the water back a little farther. Mercer's breathing grew shallow. He understood the pattern now. The river wasn't demanding blood, it was demanding acknowledgement. But confession would not only expose him, it would destroy the town's fragile illusion of righteousness. In 1863, loyalty meant survival. Admission meant treason. Caleb stepped closer to the sheriff, his small voice cutting through the chaos. "Did you push them too?" Mercer's hand tightened around the revolver. The figures in the water took another synchronized step forward. The river surged up to their chests again. The bell beneath the current rang louder than before. And from the dark surface, more faces began to rise, faces no one in Briar's Hollow had seen yet. Not prisoners, not drifters. These wore Confederate gray. The Confederate uniforms surfaced slowly, as if the river wanted everyone to see them clearly. Gray jackets floated open over pale chests. Brass buttons caught the lantern light. Some of the men still wore officer insignia stitched at the collar. Their caps drifted nearby before settling against unmoving foreheads. A collective gasp rippled through Briar's Hollow. These were not prisoners. These were soldiers. Sheriff Mercer felt the last thread of control slip through his fingers. Captain Elias Boone rose at the center of the formation, water cascading off his shoulders. His face was unmistakable, sharp jawline, neatly trimmed beard, the faint burn scar near his temple from a rail accident years prior. Boone had ridden into town the previous winter with orders from Confederate command. He had demanded accountability for missing supply crates and rumors of divided loyalties. He had questioned Mercer privately inside the jailhouse. 3 days later, Boone reportedly left Briar Hollow at dawn, bound for Marshall. No one had seen him again. Now he stood chest-deep in the Neches, eyes fixed on the sheriff. Mrs. Whittemore staggered backward. "He came to investigate," she whispered. "You said he was satisfied."
Mercer's voice came out strained. He was. The river answered with a violent swell that knocked 2 kneeling men flat into the mud. Captain Boone raised his hand. The river went still. Even the insects seemed to vanish from the night. Boone's lips parted, and when he spoke, the sound carried like a courtroom verdict. "You chose the river over the law." The words struck harder than gunfire. Mercer's militia had not only disposed of prisoners, they had silenced oversight. Boone had discovered the truth: 31 detainees executed without trial. Panic had spread. Mercer had argued it was too late to reverse course. A second decision had followed: permanent. 2 bodies had been weighted that night, not 31, 33. Jeremiah Pike looked up through tears. "You told us he drew first," he said weakly. "You said it was self-defense." Boone's lifeless eyes never left Mercer. The Confederate soldiers in the water began stepping toward the shore, boots touching mud that did not resist them. Mercer backed away. "You don't understand what war demands," he shouted, voice cracking. "If word got out, Union sympathizers would have burned this place to the ground." Caleb's father stepped between the sheriff and the river. "You burned it yourself," he said quietly. The gray-coated figures reached the bank. The 31 bodies lying side by side began to rise as well, joints bending unnaturally as water drained from their sleeves. The line between drowned and living disappeared. Captain Boone took his first full step onto land. The river did not follow. It waited, and every eye turned to Sheriff Mercer, because now there was only one confession left to make. Sheriff Edwin Mercer had commanded men in bar fights, in raids, and in midnight arrests. He had never stood trial before the dead. Captain Elias Boone stopped a few feet from him, boots planted firmly in mud that moments earlier had swallowed lanterns whole. The drowned soldiers formed a silent semicircle. Behind them, the 31 prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, shackles hanging open as if the iron itself had given up. The town watched without breathing. Mercer looked smaller now. Not physically, he was still broad-shouldered, still armed, but stripped of the authority that had protected him. Sweat streaked through the dirt on his face. His revolver hung useless at his side. "You want words?" Mercer asked, voice raw. "Fine, I made the call."
A low tremor moved through the ground. They were accused of treason, aiding the enemy. If we waited for Richmond to send wagons, half this county would have turned on us. Discipline had to be swift. Boone's expression did not change. "They were bound," Mercer continued, the rhythm of his own voice pushing him forward. "There was no court, no jury, just rumors and fear. I chose to end it." Jeremiah Pike sobbed openly now. Samuel Crowley covered his face. "And you?" Mrs. Whitmore demanded. "What of the captain?" Mercer hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. "He threatened to report us," Mercer said quietly. "Said there'd be arrests, hangings, maybe federal charges if the tide of war shifted." He swallowed hard. "I told him Briar's Hollow couldn't survive that." Boone took one deliberate step closer. "So you silenced him," Mrs. Whitmore whispered. Mercer nodded once. The admission hung in the humid night air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the river began to recede. Not violently, not in a rush. It lowered with measured calm, sliding back into its banks like a breath finally released. The drowned figures did not vanish, but their outlines softened, water dripping from them in slow, steady streams. The ground beneath the townspeople steadied. The tolling from beneath the river ceased. Mercer exhaled shakily, almost relieved. "Is that enough?" he asked. Captain Boone's head tilted slightly. The prisoners behind him lifted their shackles. Every iron cuff snapped shut at once, with Mercer at the center. Chains coiled around his wrists and ankles, locking in place before he could reach his weapon. The metal burned cold against his skin. The river did not surge this time. It opened. The mud beneath Mercer's boots liquefied, pulling him down inch by inch. He struggled, shouting orders no one moved to obey.
and as the water climbed to his chest, Captain Boone spoke one final sentence: "Accountability is not an escape." The river swallowed Mercer whole. The surface closed without a ripple. But the water did not settle back into silence, because from upstream a new shape was drifting toward Briar's Hollow, and this one was alive. At first, the shape drifting downstream looked like debris, a broken fence post, a section of dock torn loose by the shifting current. The townspeople of Briar's Hollow stood frozen along the riverbank, unsure whether the night had truly ended or merely paused. Then the shape moved against the flow. A hand gripped the edge of a half-submerged skiff. A man pulled himself upright. He was thin, gaunt in a way that spoke of starvation, not war rations. His beard hung uneven along a hollow jaw. His clothes were torn but not waterlogged, as though he had climbed from somewhere shallow rather than risen from the depths. He was breathing, alive. Caleb's father stepped forward cautiously. "Easy now," he called. "You're safe here." The man's eyes scanned the shoreline with sharp awareness, not confusion, not madness, recognition. "There are 33, he said hoarsely. The number settled over the town like a verdict already delivered. Mrs. Whitmore moved closer. "Who are you?" "I'm Daniel Harper, rail worker, taken in December." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Jeremiah Pike stared at him as if seeing a ghost in daylight. We waited you." Harper nodded once. "You tried." The air tightened again.
Harper explained in broken breaths. The militia had forced the prisoners to kneel along the bank, iron at their wrists, stones lashed to their chains. When pushed into the river, Harper struck a submerged cypress trunk instead of sinking clean. The rope binding his weight split against the wood. He drifted unconscious into a shallow bend miles south. A Union patrol found him days later. They listened. They wrote everything down. Harper met each man's gaze along the riverbank. "They're coming." No one asked who. The war had shifted since winter. Vicksburg had fallen. Union forces were pressing deeper into Confederate territory. And if Harper's testimony had reached command, Briar's Hollow would no longer be invisible. Mrs. Whitmore looked toward the quiet water. The drowned figures were gone now. No soldiers, no prisoners. Only the steady current reflects the pale hint of dawn. "Why didn't they take all of us?" Samuel Crowley whispered. Harper followed her gaze. "They weren't here for the town," he said. "They were here for the truth." In the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the rhythmic echo of horses. Not one or two, a column. Harper stepped fully onto the shore, legs trembling but steady enough to stand. "The river remembered," he said. "Now the law will too." Caleb turned toward the rising sun, the first light breaking over the trees. And along the eastern road, blue uniforms were beginning to appear. By mid-morning, Briar's Hollow belonged to the Union. Blue-coated cavalry rode in under a pale Texas sky, boots and hooves pressing into mud that had swallowed a sheriff only hours earlier. Their commanding officer, Major Nathaniel Brooks, dismounted without ceremony. He carried papers already signed, already sealed.
Daniel Harper had not been ignored. Statements were taken before noon. Names were written carefully into leather-bound ledgers. Jeremiah Pike confessed again, this time without the river rumbling beneath him. Samuel Crowley followed. Others did too. Some wept. Some stood hollow and silent. There was no public hanging that day. There was no mob. There was something colder, documentation. Major Brooks walked the river bank himself. He studied the disturbed earth, the impressions where 31 bodies had once lain in a line too straight to be natural. He ordered the area excavated properly. Graves were dug deeper, respectfully this time. Markers were carved. 33 names, including Captain Elias Boone. When Brooks asked what happened to Sheriff Mercer, no one spoke immediately. Caleb finally answered, "The river kept him." Brooks did not laugh. By late afternoon, the cavalry escorted the accused men south under guard. Briar's Hollow did not burn. It did not collapse. It remained standing, just stripped of the lie that had held it together. Mrs. Whittemore reopened her door that evening and placed a lantern in the window facing the river. Others followed, not as a warning, as acknowledgment. The Neches flowed steady and unremarkable once more. No figures stood in its current. No bell tolled from beneath its surface. The banks looked ordinary again. Mud, roots, drifting timber. But every summer after that, when drought lowered the waterline, something peculiar happened. The river never revealed bones again. It revealed shackles. Iron links surfaced in clusters along the shore, rusted but intact, as if laid out for counting. 33 of them every single year. No more, no less. Caleb Turner grew older. He would tell the story to his grandchildren in measured tones, never embellishing, never softening the truth. He became a quiet man, one who understood that justice does not always arrive in courtrooms.
Sometimes it rises from beneath your feet. Briar's Hollow survived the war. It was rebuilt. It prospered modestly, yet no one in town ever claimed the river as friendly again. Because the Neches had proven something lasting in 1863. It did not forget, and it did not forgive. If stories like this, where history and consequence collide in the dark, fascinate you, make sure you subscribe to the Canon of Darkness. There are more rivers out there, and not all of them stay silent.